Because here at Talk, we've been compiling a little list for you, something you can indulge in as to all the people who aren't going to prison because, well, there's no prison spaces. Funny that they were able to scare a load of them up for rioters. And just earlier today, there's been a convicted child rapist, Reese Newman, 33. I think he is in Newport. And instead of being sentenced to prison, he should have been jailed for 2 months. It doesn't really seem a lot if you're a child rapist, but there you go. But it's been suspended for 18 months. And the reason it has been suspended, she told Newman, the only reason you have escaped immediate custody today is because of the prison overcrowding crisis. So child rapist is going to serve prison time for just 2 months for that, but not now, because there's nowhere left to go in prison.
I mean, this is absolutely sick, isn't it? It is totally grotesque, a word that I feel like I'm overusing, but there's so many reasons to use it tonight. How can it possibly be right that a child rapist walks free while somebody who, I don't know, knocks over a wheelie bin and shouts some hurty words in a heated riot situation gets literally years in prison? Somebody with no track record of doing any harm to others and knocking over wheelie bins and shouting hurty words is clearly not something that we in this country want to encourage. Sure, it needs to be punished. I don't think that it requires literally years in jail, and certainly not if that means that those who commit offences against little children end up walking free. That has got to be totally topsy-turvy, hasn't it?
It seems that way. I totally agree with your perception of that. But it's interesting, when I was speaking earlier to a lawyer, they said, well, actually, when things are done, when prosecutions are meted out, they have to be done within the framework of the law. So maybe there's a wider debate we need to have about how that law and the, the set of laws actually look. And I want to talk about that a bit more with Sarah Phillimore. She is a barrister. Let's bring in Sarah now. Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
When you put these things side by side, we've sort of made a list here at Talk of various paedophiles who have been avoiding prison, basically. People who haven't had any prison sentence at all, people with suspended sentence. And some of these things that they've been charged with, you kind of think in other countries they'd be lucky to go in prison and never get out again. And yet these people don't seem to be ending up in jail. And then people who had committed appalling acts, let's say, during the riots, but who hadn't had brushes with the law previously, have been sentenced very quickly and given quite a long period of time in prison.
Well, I asked on social media, because I haven't done criminal law for quite a long time, but I don't imagine the purpose of the criminal justice system has changed since I was studying and practicing, and that's basically to send a message about what society will and won't tolerate, to deter people, to punish them, obviously, to rehabilitate them if we can, but basically also to keep people safe. So prison has a lot of justifications as to why it's needed. And I thought, this does seem really weird. So I asked on social media, so can any criminal lawyer help me as to what's going on? Because this seems odd. And crickets. I didn't get a single response. So I did a bit of Googling, and I think I found the answer. At the end of last year, there was a particularly nasty case of somebody who for 13 years had been accessing a Dropbox folder full of the most vile images, including category A images. And he was given a 20-month sentence that was suspended for 2 years. And the National Crime Agency actually said, this is wrong. We don't feel good about this. They worked out that 80% of men convicted for possession of indecent images were not going to prison. But I think they provided the answer because their director of operations said, look, there are between 680,000 and 800,000 of these men in the country. We know the prison system was at capacity around July, I think about 97,000 places. So the NCA said quite rightly, whatever you think about these men, they're not going to prison because we do not have the room for them. So I think what we need rather urgently is a discussion about precisely what message we're meant to be sending, because we could see with the writers, the message was very clearly, you are disgraceful, you are disgusting, we will not tolerate this for a moment. So you will go to prison, and to make room for you, we will release about 5,000 prisoners, who I assume may have included some of those 20% of men who are actually convicted. So I do think if the National Crime Agency is worried enough to raise this as an issue at the end of last year, I don't think the people doing it can just be dismissed, as I'm afraid a lot of them are. So I think, yeah, definitely.
Do you think that, let's look at some of the prosecutions for the rioters, and, you know, there's been so many, I think there's about over 1,000 now, that by no means have I even remotely looked into all of them, but it seemed to me the first lot being prosecuted were people who had had many brushes with the law. They were essentially career criminals and ne'er-do-wells, and people who, quite frankly, shouldn't have been roaming the streets to throw bricks at police and, you know, destroy town centres anyway. And then you had the second slew of people, and in that slew of people were, you know, people who'd never had any sort of criminal record, and people who'd put some pretty horrific things on Twitter. I mean, one of them was a Conservative councillor's wife who had sort of said, burn down the mosque with everybody inside it. That is, you know, really awful. No one is saying that anyone should ever say anything like that. That is a vile sentiment. But there have been all sorts of people saying all sorts of things lately in all sorts of sides of the debate. People, you know, during the pro-Palestine marches shouting things which, you know, they think they're using clever words, but they're actually calling for the elimination of an entire nation state. People who might be shouting, you know, jihad, which they say, well, it means an internal struggle, but they must know it's provocative. And I think that what's happened is there's been this free-for-all where people have seen other people speaking with such coarse and vile language, and it's sort of going unpunished, that quite ordinary folk who probably don't actually think that way, I would assume, I don't know her, but I'd assume that woman probably doesn't actually think that way, or didn't think anyone would read that and then go and act on it. And frankly, I don't think there's any burden of evidence that anyone did read that and then went and acted on it. And yet she's got a very lengthy sentence, and to me, that just seems a bit, I don't know, it doesn't sit well with me.
Well, I think you've got to trust your instincts on this. I mean, the criminal justice system is meant to serve us as a society. It's meant to send a message about what we will and will not tolerate. I looked at the sentencing guidelines for men convicted of possession of indecent images, and to mitigate, they have to show remorse and have a previous exemplary character. Now, again, that didn't seem to stand in good stead for some of these people convicted. And I want to know why. I want to know who has decided that somebody with, I don't know, a handful of followers on Twitter or Facebook who says something disgusting can be held to have risked causing or inciting other people to do the disgusting things they were talking about. I mean, that's, I think, a very real problem, that causal link. And like you say, if they're a previous good character, they got carried away stupidly, because it's easy to talk big on a screen. That's a very well-known, the disinhibition effect, because you don't have the person in front of you. You can say what disgusting things you like because you feel empowered to do it. But if those people were shocked and remorseful and a previous good character, I do have to ask, what actually is the purpose of sending them to prison? Is it just to deter? Is it to punish? Is it to protect? I mean, I'm not sure I feel the need to be protected by somebody who got carried away online. It is difficult, though, because some of those things, as you said, were incitement to murder people.
Right.
And I do think as a society we need to have pretty clear standards about that.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, when you're talking about, you know, between potentially 680,000, 800,000 men in this country right now who have some really horrific images of child abuse on their hard drives, I would imagine, I can't imagine actually, it'd be a massive number, the number of people in this country who've ever, you know, sat at home on their keyboards with a, you know, gin and tonic or whatever, feeling particularly wound up and said something really horrible on somebody's thread. I mean, I've had plenty of people say, you know, I hope you die and all sorts of vile things to me. And if you're going to, if this woman's in prison for saying that and you can't find a causal link, then you'd have to build, I don't know, about 5 million mega prisons at this point to get everyone who's ever said something horrible on Twitter or social media facing the same sort of sentence. It does seem to me as well that this was, I'm not saying it should have been or shouldn't have been rushed through. I get that it needed to be done very quickly as a deterrent. But some of these people, you know, the brushes with the law, just being dragged to a police station would probably be enough to make them never log into social media again.
Well, you know, and why not some sort of community payback? You know, you've harmed the community, as you said, by these coarse and horrible things, and it is corrosive. It does upset people and make them frightened. I think what we've missed as a country is the opportunity to have a proper conversation about this, because the problem is there's been all this stuff, you mustn't be hateful, we're going to come down on you really hard. But then what is meant by hate? As we've seen with all the argument about sex and gender, stating a biological fact is said by some people to be hate. We are all now extremely confused about what we can and cannot say. I think it's been a massive wasted opportunity. We've had a decade of really trying to stop people being hateful, which I think is a noble aim. But what we forgot to do was properly define what we mean by hate, properly examine the parameters of Article 10. I mean, it took Harry Miller had to take 2 state agents to court on his own to get the obvious recognition that non-crime hate incidents were unlawful, and that you couldn't just have people subjectively reporting that they felt they were victims of hate. You can't do that, because we had some completely insane complaints that had to be then recorded. So I think we've really dropped the ball as a society. And if the reaction is we're going to come down hard and we're just going to crush you, that might in the short term have a deterrent effect. But I think we can see from the conversations that we're having now, it risks having a medium to long term, very adverse effect, and encouraging people not to trust those in authority, to feel they're not being listened to. Yeah. And that is really dangerous because, like I said, we've only got about 97,000 places in prisons.
Right, and you know what? I'm going to bring Isabel into that because I thought it was really interesting when you said, you know, for the last 10 years we've been perhaps nobly trying to stop people being hateful. My concern is we're only trying to stop some people being hateful in a way that is defined that some people think that this is hateful when other people think it's just blimmin' common sense. And I'm talking about stuff like when, before the Cass report came out, if you even tried to say anything about kids probably shouldn't be going through, you know, puberty blocking and so on and so forth, people could have reported you up in Scotland for a hate crime. I mean, Isabel, is that sort of also part of the problem, that the two-tier Kia thing, well, it might be two-tier Kia, but the two-tierism's been going on for quite a long time now.
So Sarah made a really important point there. I mean, my own perspective on this is that the word hate has become massively overused to the point that it's completely devalued. I mean, on a daily basis, I'm accused of being hateful and hating. I mean, I actually don't really hate very much. And I certainly don't hate many people at all. I certainly don't hate groups of people or, frankly, any individual that I can think of. And yet it's become an absolutely routine, lazy thing to throw at anyone with an opinion that you disagree with. Oh, they're obviously hateful. You know, they have some questions over the value of mass uncontrolled immigration. Therefore, they must hate foreigners. I mean, this is a complete nonsense, but it's become very, very widespread. And as Sarah said, it devalues the whole notion of hate crime and that whole thing, the nonsense of only having to feel that you're a victim of hate crime to be a victim of hate crime is quite patently absurd and led to all sorts of completely wasted resources on that front. The other thing I wanted to pick up, or I really like to hear Sarah's perspective on, is the extent to which sentencing in recent weeks since the riot has been quite blatantly politicized, and whether that is a good or bad thing. I wonder if there's a case in the light of all of this for having not so much sentencing guidelines, but much clearer and stricter formula. You know, if you commit certain crimes, this is what happens, you know, and it's not really, I'm just throwing it out there.
I mean, do you think that, Sarah, that surely the legal system should be entirely separate from politics? It shouldn't be politicised at all?
Oh, absolutely. This is an essential part of any democracy. You have to have an independent judiciary, a legal system that is separate from the government. And the problem I have, I don't want to give rein to full-throated conspiracy theories, but when on social media the Attorney General tweets and the CPS tweet, effectively, we're coming to get you, it does make me quite worried. And there is a perception, whether it's real or not, there is definitely a perception that there has been a political influence on the responses to the riots. And that's a problem, because whether it's true or not, it's the perception that's the damaging thing. Frankly...
Sei sotto un cielo sbagliato.